I had mentioned to many of you that we chose to have Elizabeth's panel first simply because once we try to probe the question of what is terrorism, that then becomes the foundational panel for all our other discussions, and hopefully we were able to achieve this purpose. Our second panel of the conference is basically going to be talking about key policy challenges with regard to many of our strategies and what the United States is doing. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our panel chair. Been a long day already. Our panel chair, the Vice Provost at Duke University for International Affairs and Development, Professor Gilbert. Gil?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And we have on this panel 4 panelists, not 3. And we have the same amount of time that the last panel had. So I've asked each of our panelists to speak for just about 15 minutes. I will try to be a tough cop, so I will be handing reminders out. And then if they exceed their 15 minutes, there will be severe consequences. And I'm going to introduce all the panel very briefly, but then as each person speaks, I will provide more detail about that particular speaker, because there will be people coming and going, and it's always frustrating if you walk into a panel that's already started and you have no idea who's going to speak next. Our 4 panelists are Michael Vickers, who is Director of Strategic Studies at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Thomas McNamara, who is former Ambassador to Colombia and former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, Professor Martha Crenshaw, and Nancy Campbell, Professor in Global Issues and Democratic Thought in the Department of Government at Wesleyan University, and Bruce Jentleson, who is Director of the Terry Sanford Institute of Public Policy and Professor of Public Policy and Political Science here at Duke University. Our first speaker will be Michael Vickers, and so I will provide you with more information about him. Michael is currently a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense for the 2005 Quadrennial Defense Review. From 1973 to 1986, Mr. Vickers served as a Army Special Forces officer and CIA operations officer with extensive operational and combat experience in Central America and the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Central Asia. During the mid-1980s, he was the principal strategist for the largest covert action program in CIA's history, the paramilitary operation that drove the Soviet Army out of Afghanistan and played a major role in ending the Cold War. His Afghan experiences described in the New York Times bestseller and soon to become major motion picture starring Tom Hanks called Charlie Wilson's War. Mr. Vickers holds advanced degrees in business administration from the Wharton School and in strategic studies from Johns Hopkins. He will complete his PhD dissertation this spring on the structure of military revolutions. His most recent publication is The Revolution and War, and he continues to consult extensively on global war issues. Mr. Vickers.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about policy imperatives and challenges facing the U.S. emanating from the global war on terrorism in 3 areas: strategy that we should pursue, capabilities that we need to develop, and then how we might organize the U.S. national security establishment or reorganize it. Before I do, as Thucydides reminded us some 2,500 years ago or so, it's always good as you embark upon a conflict to ask, what is to be our war? What's the nature of the war we're in? You may recall he tells us about the Spartan king Archidamus making the net assessment just prior to the Peloponnesian. Many have criticized the term, as I think someone on the first panel did, the global war on terrorism, saying that it's a gross misnomer. In fact, the only accurate word in it is the. But I'd like to suggest that that's not entirely conflict, of course, exploits globalization, as you mentioned previously, for communications, finance, labor mobility. Some of the key organizations are multinational in character, combining expatriates from a number of countries. The one thing that animates them is a common vision or shared ideology. We use that word, although not a completely shared ideology. Finally, there's a significant threat from within the West. Many argue that the greatest threat the United States faces for another 9/11 attack is not from the greater Middle East, even though it is from terrorism, but really from the West itself, particularly the Islamic diaspora in Western Europe. That's, of course, where we were struck from on 9/11, and a number of scholars have looked at the radicalization process that has occurred among a number of these upper middle class college educated folks as they go to Western Europe and through a variety of factors get more militant. Again, if you look at the threats that we've had since 9/11, the scares we had in the run-up to the U.S. election last year, they emanated as much from the UK as they did from Pakistan or elsewhere. And then finally, it clearly is not a war on terrorism. Terrorism is a tactic, but again, indirection is fairly useful given we consider broad U.S. broad strategic aims. The U.S. government clearly knows the priority is that it's a war on Islamic extremism, or terrorism manifested by Islamic extremism. Now, the war has an uncertain duration. Secretary Rumsfeld described this as a very peculiar, different kind of war right after 9/11. Much of it, some of it could be seen and familiar, but much of it wouldn't. Many think it will likely be protracted, lasting several decades, but that's really anybody's guess. There's volatility to it. It's highly asymmetric in terms of the combatants and their resources and their techniques, and there's great difficulty in measuring progress. Secretary Rumsfeld wrote a memo about a year and a half ago that was subsequently leaked. It says, how are we doing? Can anybody tell me? And we're still not a lot better at telling them exactly how well we're doing and where we are along. As I think one of the previous speakers mentioned, this war isn't going to end with a surrender signed on the battleship Missouri. It's going to peter out or go on for a long time. Now, with respect to the policy implications and challenges in these three areas, first being strategy, we have a range of strategic choices with respect to offense and defense, with respect to how much we devote to resources at home versus overseas, whether we focus on state actors, non-state actors, whether we concentrate our efforts or distribute them, whether we adopt a direct or unilateral, sometimes called or indirect approach, and which instruments of power, political, economic, military, we emphasize. I'd like to talk briefly about strategy in a couple of these areas, the choice between offense and defense and direct and indirect. But I'd like to emphasize that the great danger in U.S. strategy looking ahead is that we revert back over some time. That's the success of the global war on terrorism to pre-9/11 strategy and the characteristics described back by the conference. 9/11 represented not just an intelligence failure, as the 9/11 Commission documented states, armies, we're now finding our greatest challenges in the area of social problems. What makes these societies stick? Where is the cleavage with the radical movement? And I think as the earlier speaker said about social science, U.S. government is dependent on that and really know that. And then I could talk about the implications for special operations forces, for conventional forces, for the U.S. government and roles and missions across our departments in the national security establishment, but I'll save those for questions.
Our next speaker is Thomas E. McNamara, who is a career diplomat. He has had overseas experience in Paris, Lubumbashi, Bukavu, Moscow, Kinshasa. He is, his background, in the 1970s, he was involved in most major arms control issues, serving in embassies or on negotiating delegations and in the Department of State and the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. His background in regional security affairs includes every major area of the globe. He was responsible for regional security affairs as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, 1983 to 1986, before his first tour on the National Security Council as Director of Counterterrorism and Narcotics. From 1988 to 1991, he was the U.S. Ambassador to Colombia. Following that assignment, he returned to Washington to work at the National Security Council as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for International Programs and African Affairs and Senior Director for International Programs. That's a repeat here in African Affairs. Following that, he headed the State Department Office of the Ambassador at Large for Counterterrorism. Then he served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs in the Clinton administration. Ambassador McNamara.
That works? All right. Let me get my... According to our chairman, this is very important. And I'm sure it is because we have other speakers who have a lot more to say than I, maybe. Let me talk just briefly about one aspect of the strategy for the war on terror. And here I would differ a bit with Michael Vickers. I think it's a bit of a sterile debate as to whether or not this is a war. Depends upon what you mean by war. In the United States, we've had wars on paper, war on this, that, and the other thing, war on cancer, war on drugs, war on terror. I kind of look at this as a protracted struggle. I take that from an old Cold War analysis, which is, by the way, another kind of war. A protracted struggle in which there are, and in this respect, it's along the lines of what Michael Vickers just did say, not likely to have a lot of conventional military activity such as we see in usual warfare, but more having to do with, in fact, social, religious, economic, and as well as political issues to be handled. And therefore, to do this, I think it's quite true that the United States cannot do it alone. So the aspect of this strategy that I'd like to focus on is, what do we do internationally? How do we organize ourselves internationally? What tools do we have to use internationally in order to make this come out better for us than if we don't effectively use our international tools? In a way, I think it's useful to talk particularly about the United Nations, and I'll focus in on that in a minute, as one of the tools that one can use internationally, but one that has distinct shortcomings, and one that we have not effectively used up until now, in large measure because until 2001, 9/11, we really didn't focus on international organizations and the organizing of the international environment to maximize our benefits in this protracted struggle. I'll start by saying that one of the things we have to do in the international sphere is to, and here I will go to a wartime analogy, shape the battlefield. Military analysts know how important it is to shape the battlefield. It's a central requirement of any strategy. In this protracted struggle, there are a number of ways to advance the goal by shaping the battlefield. For one thing, it has to do with economic matters, reducing and restricting the terrorists' ability to move funds around the world. Also restricting as far as possible safe havens, putting additional constraints on travel through the introduction of sophisticated travel documents, building up law enforcement capabilities and judicial capabilities of our allies and partners in this struggle. And this is particularly true in the poorer countries, but it's true not only in the poorer countries, it's true in the United States, and it's true in Europe and in Asia, where the law enforcement and judicial institutions have not been geared to deal with terrorism and terrorism-related activities. Increasing pressure on state sponsors, including going in and changing governments if necessary when there is an overt evidence, substantial evidence that states are sponsoring the terrorism. If we're really good at it, however, we can change the state sponsorship without the situation without actually going in militarily. The best example of that, of course, is Libya. And finally, by promoting institutions, norms, and laws, treaties, conventions that will help make our job easier and make the job of the other side much more difficult. I'm going to examine now the UN resolution which was passed shortly after 9/11, in fact less than 3 weeks after it, known as Resolution 1373 of the Security Council. It's typical of this way that the UN has of approaching this war on terror, this struggle, because it's done thus far, it's created 3 institutional mechanisms within the Security Council framework for conducting the United Nations efforts against terrorism. One is the committee known as the Counterterrorism Committee, which came out of Resolution 1373. Another is an earlier resolution against Al-Qaeda and Taliban, known as Resolution 1267. They all have very fancy names. And the last and most recent is Resolution 1540, which was directed at the problem of the nexus between weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. But since I don't have time to discuss all 3 of these, I'm going to look at the CTC and note some of its failings and some of its the benefits that it has for us. And I will suggest, in fact, I state frankly, that all 3 of these committees and all 3 of these mechanisms have substantially the same benefits and weaknesses. The CTC development has been was in the first 18 months fairly vigorous. It provided some very important strategic advantages to the United States on the international scene. First of all, by taking a number of terrorism conventions and proposing that states actively sign if they haven't signed, and ratify if they haven't ratified these conventions, and then to implement them. And the various states that were pushing this, including the United States, agreed to try and assist these countries in changing, in fact, their national legislation in order to enable them to implement the conventions. Well, as a result of that, within 18 months, those 12 conventions went from 2 states having ratified all 12 of them to about 40 states having ratified all 12 of them. Now, 4 years after the event, we can see that there's between 65 and 70 states that have ratified all 12 of these conventions. In addition, a number of states have ratified many, but not all 12. So what the UN was able to do, and this is through 1373 as well as these other committees, what it's able to do is to shape the battlefield in terms of the norms and conventions that states will at least agree to practice, if not actually practice, and most who don't practice it are not practicing it not out of maliciousness, but out of weakness. The CTC has been able to push in this regard in a very, very effective way, much more effectively than the United States or any other country, or even smaller group of countries could have done on its own. It also was able to bring together, for the first time, in March of 2003, at the invitation of the CTC, 60 international organizations that agreed voluntarily, since they weren't obliged to do so, to set up an information network around the United Nations and around the CTC to inform each other about what they're doing, what best practices, codes, and standards that are relevant to counterterrorism efforts could be shared. They agreed to develop and maintain mechanisms to assist their member nations, in all cases they're intergovernmental organizations, to establish these mechanisms to assist them to meet their international obligations and to raise their capacity to fight terrorism. Capacity building is the second area where the UN has an enormous advantage over any particular country like the United States, trying to build capacity voluntarily rather than trying to build capacity by buying it or by instilling it and installing it. Both of those latter are useful, but not nearly as effective as moving through an international organization such as the United Nations. The third area where the UN and international organizations have an advantage, which we can utilize, is that there's a great potential to motivate efforts in the international community, to promote coordination and cooperation among nations, among governments, and among international organizations themselves. And to the extent that we can get the United Nations and regional and functional organizations to take actions, take them on their own, establish programs that will effectively raise the capacity of their member states in those regions and in those functions, it's going to be very useful for us to use this mechanism. But there are also activities that are beyond the scope of the UN and beyond the scope of many international organizations, regionally in particular, but also functionally. Improving and propagating methodologies and technologies for countering terrorism is not something that the UN does very well. Establishing international standards and practices in the various relevant areas as distinct from legitimizing and fostering those that have been established, that's an area where the UN is relatively weak. Functional organizations tend to be stronger in that regard. Developing positive and negative incentives for slow or reluctant nations who are slow and reluctant in undertaking effective measures against terrorists and terrorist organizations is another area where the UN is relatively weak. It's weak because of the culture and the attitude in the UN organization itself, which shies away from tough, what we used to call in the Political Military Bureau when I headed it, black hat efforts as opposed to white hat efforts. There are a number of nations who will do anything if you just say that this is peaceful, quiet and calm, and will shy away from anything, at least in their neighborhood, that suggests the use of force, the threat of the use of force, or even heavy pressure. So what do we do? Do we just sort of leave the international arena open beyond this relatively benign development of capacity and moving towards defensive mechanisms that various states can use against the terrorists? I think not. I want to suggest that there is a very strong need for our strategy to be successful to create at least one new international organization. If you take a look at the international scenery, the landscape, and examine major issues that are transnational in scope, such as refugees, human rights, terror, drugs, organized crime, there's at least one international organization that is exclusively devoted to monitoring, to propagating, and to moving on that particular international issue. You've got the Commissioner for Human Rights, the Commissioner for Refugees, there's Interpol, and others. I'm just citing one for each. In the case of weapons of mass destruction, you have the IAEA and the Chemical Weapons Organization. I could go on. The exception is terrorism. In fact, the weak, new, or one we call almost nascent organizations that I referred to earlier, such as 1373, 1267, and 1540, those committees are, in fact, the only international organizations that are exclusively devoted to terrorism. That's an institutional vacuum. And other transnational problems are being more effectively dealt with by the international community because the institutional vacuum either doesn't exist or is substantially less than it is in the case of terrorism. Without a strong, and I mean a relatively strong as compared with the institutions that we have, we're not going to be successful internationally in countering the terrorist effort, terrorist threat. Let's take a look at nonproliferation and use that as a kind of a model, and I'll close with this. That model is useful because those of you who are old enough to remember 1965 and the Nonproliferation Treaty remember how weak, stumbling, and ineffective the IAEA was in the late 1960s. And take a look at the IAEA today. It has changed dramatically. It still has a long way to go. It's not yet the kind of institution that one would say is a first-rate, politically reliable institution in every respect and in every instance, but it is vastly better than it was when it started out. That's a result of 40 years, basically, of building institutions and building international consensus that weapons of mass destruction are something that need to be controlled and needs to be suppressed. The UN and other organizations have not yet adopted that attitude and have not yet been willing to set up those institutions. That's something that I think has to be a major element in our strategy as we move forward from the year 2005. Alone, we are not sufficient. Alone, the United Nations is not sufficient. It needs to be part of a larger organizational structure with institutions that are effectively moving towards countering the terrorist threat. There is no single institution, there is no single country that can do it. Multiple partners at the regional level, in functional areas, and of course at the international level of the United Nations are going to be necessary. In that structure, at least one global professional expert organization is necessary. And I think the model needs to be found in places such as weapons of mass destruction. With that, I'll let it go, and have I done it within 15? Perfect, thank you.
Our next speaker is Martha Crenshaw, who is the Colin and Nancy Campbell Professor of Global Issues and Democratic Thought and Professor of Government at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, where she has taught since 1974. She has written extensively on the issue of political terrorism. Her first article, The Concept of Revolutionary Terrorism, was published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution in 1972. Her more recent work includes the chapter on coercive diplomacy and the response to terrorism in the book United States and Coercive Diplomacy, published by the U.S. Institute for Peace, and Terrorism Strategies and Grand Strategies in a book entitled Attacking Terrorism, published by Georgetown University Press. She currently chairs the Task Force on Political Violence and Terrorism of the American Political Science Association. She serves on the editorial board of the journals International Security, Orbis, and Terrorism and Political Violence. Her current research focuses on why the United States is the target of terrorism. Professor Crenshaw.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to try to speak from here. Can you all hear me? Yes? Great. First of all, with regard to the first panel, I have a small confession to make, which is that I'm actually going to be part of the new Center for Excellence in the Study of Terrorism at the University of Maryland. So I guess I disagree with some of my colleagues that social science might not have a role to play. I also have to say, since the introduction has dated me completely, that I wrote an article on the causes of terrorism in 1981. And we're still debating what the causes of terrorism are, and we don't know. We're also still debating definitions, and with regard to what Ambassador McNamara said, of course, one of the things that's held up the UN has been the lack of a definition of terrorism. They couldn't define it in 1973, but I'm happy to say that just in March, Kofi Annan did offer a definition of terrorism. Even the Counterterrorist Committee had not tried to define terrorism. They just thought, we'll deal with it without defining it because it's so controversial. So since our task today is to pinpoint challenges, I'll say that those things remain a challenge for us, defining terrorism and trying to ascertain what the causes of the phenomenon are. But let me point to 5 other challenges that they don't have a clear categorization other than to say that I hope some of them are non-obvious. However, the first one is not non-obvious, and Michael Vickers has already mentioned it, and that is the difficulty in measuring progress in defeating terrorism. I won't get into the question of whether or not it's a war, but defining what our goals are and defining what progress would be, how we would measure progress toward those goals. As you can see from the 2 previous speakers, we have a lot of goals, a lot of very different and disparate goals in terms of what we want to do about terrorism. Have we established a priority among those goals so that we know which we want to establish, which we want to achieve the most, and which we want to achieve when? I'm not sure that we have. And as Secretary Rumsfeld did indeed point out about 1.5 years ago, very difficult to find what concrete markers would be to say that you were making progress. I mean, some are suggested by what people have said before, but it's very difficult really to identify them. The U.S. government has been criticized pretty roundly for using body counts as a measure of success in the war on terrorism. They say that a real measure of success would be to prevent recruitment into terrorist organizations. If so, how do we measure that? So I would say that remains a big challenge for us. A second challenge that I think is related to the first is that when we do have success, maybe what we do is not end the threat, not eradicate it, not reduce it, 2 aims that are mentioned in the National Strategy for Combating Terrorism, but we change the threat itself. And I think I could make an argument to you that since September the 11th, we have had some successes, but what they have done is transform the threat from a relatively centrally organized, territorially based conspiracy located in a state sponsor, located where there was sanctuary, to a threat that may be much more dangerous. A very disparate, decentralized, non-territorially based threat, which has already been described today, which Michael Vickers described, one in which there is less state control over what these groups might do, where these groups are even more resistant to penetration by intelligence services, and where they proceed by inspiration as much as by central direction. It's very much more, I would say, of an individualized and small group phenomenon than it was before. It always is a phenomenon of that sort, as the first panel indicated, but I would argue to you that it's becoming even more so and maybe becoming more dangerous. This threat, since it's spread around the world, we pointed out that perhaps one of the United States' goals is to prevent another catastrophic event on American soil, on the American homeland. And we know any social science can tell you, and this was mentioned in the first panel, very difficult to either predict or prevent a very rare event. That cannot be a marker of your success, whether or not you have prevented it or whether or not it has happened. But in succeeding, if we have succeeded, which we don't know, in preventing such an attack, again, another 9/11, have we actually displaced or deflected the threat onto other countries? Morocco, Spain, Indonesia, Australia, Tunisia, and other countries. So in protecting ourselves, are we in effect making other states more vulnerable, states indeed that may lack the capacity to deal with terrorism? So this has to be taken into account as well when we look at challenges for the future. A third challenge, I think, for the United States gets us more into the realm of domestic politics. And this is what I would regard as something of a paradox. In order to mobilize public support for its policies, and the government has put a lot of effort into mobilizing supports for its policies, and rightly so, you have no choice as a government but to constantly maintain a public awareness of the very reality and closeness of the threat. That is, if what we wish to do is to maintain our own style of life, and if we want to have a world in which civilized people live free of the fear of terrorism, and I'm quoting directly from the National Strategy for Combating Terrorism, can we do that if we're constantly reminding people of the threat? But do we need to constantly remind them of the threat, both in order to protect them and in order to mobilize their support for policies that are very costly and increasingly costly? This brings me to a fourth challenge, and that is the sustainability of the policy as we have it now. This is a strategy where our goals lie decades ahead of us, probably, a very long way in the future, even if we know we've reached the end of a war on terrorism. We know for sure, we think it's going to be a long way. Can we sustain the policies that we have and that we're advocating in order to win the war on terrorism over the long haul for a period of decades? Can we sustain them financially? And I would argue to you that this is a big challenge. I don't know whether we're going to be able to shift the cost balance, as Michael Vickers outlined as a goal. It would be a worthy thing to do, but can we do it? I'm afraid that the challenge is that the cost is mostly going to be for us more so than for them, that it will always be much cheaper for them, much more expensive for us to protect ourselves from terrorism. There's a moral cost, which some of the panels later today and tomorrow are going to get to. A big public debate over the ethics of the response to terrorism. Are these costs that the American public is going to be willing to bear for decades into the future? The cost to civil liberties, the cost to one's convenience standing in line at airports. I'm not sure of this, but I think it's a challenge ahead of us. I would argue that there is a fifth challenge, and it's a challenge that I will conclude with, and it gets us back more to the international realm. And this has to do with the very perplexing relationship between democracy and terrorism. One of the purposes of the war in Iraq, it had several purposes. Of course, the WMD debate is still with us. Whether or not Saddam Hussein had any connection to terrorism, no, he didn't. So if the purpose in Iraq is to spread democracy, then the argument that's made implicitly and explicitly is that spreading democracy will assist us in defeating terrorism, reducing and eliminating terrorism. And part of that argument is based on the assumption that was mentioned this morning in the first panel, that repressive regimes, the actions of the state, are a cause of terrorism. And they are, but not all repressive regimes do engender terrorism. And of course, as Professor Hafiz has written in his book, governments that are extremely repressive can usually repress terrorism pretty efficiently. So if we accept that, then we would say that democracy is a good thing and that it will help in the war on terrorism. There's a problem, however. There are at least two problems. One is that transitions to democracy notoriously provoke violence for a variety of reasons, so that in this process of transition that can last quite a long time, even if the end result is successful, quite a lot of violence can accompany it. And so if you're saying, for example, to the American public, I want you to pay for spreading democracy around the world, because in the end, it's going to mean an end to terrorism. You're, again, looking for a policy that you're going to have to sustain over a long period of time. Furthermore, I'm sad to say this, but democracy is not a panacea for terrorism, and even mature, established, liberal democracies have been threatened by terrorism. You might say that terrorism is reduced in established democratic states, but it's not going to go away. And here's a last problem that gets us back to some of the issues that the previous speakers have mentioned, and that is what I would call a sort of, if you'll pardon the sort of political philosophy aspect of this, and since I'm not a political philosopher, I can sort of be looser in my references and someone who's more knowledgeable than I might have to be, but it's sort of a Kantian dilemma in the sense of a democratic peace dilemma. If we agree that repressive regimes do cause terrorism in some circumstances and in some ways, and that if we had democracies around the world, everything would be better, what this means is in a democratic peace, everybody's got to be a democracy. If repressive regimes successfully repress terrorism on their own territories, they may merely export it to where it's easier for conspiracies to organize, where it's easier to act, and against targets that are less likely and less capable of destroying them. And I think this is something of what we saw in Saudi Arabia and that we saw in Egypt, and indeed that we might have seen and might be seeing in Pakistan. So we've got to be concerned about the fact that violence can be displaced in a sort of displacement of aggression from the countries that are the original sources to countries where it's easier to organize and easier to act. And I'm not sure that we've really fully come to grips with that challenge, either in public policy or in the public debate. So on that rather pessimistic note, I will conclude and wait for more questions. Thank you.
Our next speaker is my colleague here at Duke, Bruce Jentleson. As I mentioned before, he is director of the Stanford Institute of Public Policy here and professor of public policy and political science. He is a leading expert on a wide range of issues of American foreign policy and has extensive policy experience. In 1999 and 2000, Bruce served as senior foreign policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore and the Gore-Lieberman presidential campaign. In 1993 to 94, he was on the State Department policy planning staff as special assistant to the director with a broad range of policy responsibilities, including serving as a member of the U.S. delegation to the Middle East multilateral arms control and regional security talks. Before that, in 1987 and 88, while a Council on Foreign Relations International Fellow, he first served as foreign policy advisor to then Senator Gore. Prior to coming to Duke, Jentleson was professor of political science at the University of California, Davis, director of the UC Davis Washington Center, and was Washington Research Director of the UC Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation, as well as a senior fellow at the United States Institute for Peace and a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution. His publications include numerous articles and 7 books, including American Foreign Policy, The Dynamics of Choice in the 21st Century, another book entitled Opportunities Missed, Opportunities Seized, Preventive Diplomacy in the Post-Cold War World, the 4-volume, he was editor of the 4-volume Encyclopedia of U.S. Foreign Relations, and also author of a book published in 1994, With Friends Like These, Reagan, Bush, and Saddam, 1982 to 1990. Bruce.
Thanks very much, Gil. The guy that goes last with a great panel like this has little left to be said, so I probably could just sit down and say they said it all, but but I will try to limit my time to open it up for questions. But I really do, the subject we've been dealing with about key policy challenges is quite broad. And so let me just make a series of really 4 sets of comments, some of which add to and some of which supplement what my colleagues have said. I think the first point, and Martha Crenshaw made this particularly in her comments, is the importance of trying to keep this issue at the top of the policy agenda. It is a key policy and political challenge. and for reasons that I believe, and I think we all share, come from the significance of the threats we continue to face. Let me say that in the last presidential campaign, I was actually working closely with the Kerry campaign and was actually co-chairing what's called a foreign policy development operation for a transition that didn't happen. But nevertheless, it is one of those moments where you really have a moment to think. You're not in a campaign and just writing one-liners for speeches, and business hasn't started, and you're not writing just one-page memos. And we had actually commissioned a whole series of papers in the beginnings of what might have been a national security strategy. We've been joking we should publish this as what American foreign policy could have been, but haven't found a publisher for it yet under that title. But the point I want to make is that in our view, at least what we were going to recommend to that administration, was very much absolutely the sense that this issue had to stay at the top of the agenda. And it had to stay at the top of the agenda for a number of reasons. One is I've always felt that the crucial thing that happened on September 11th for us as a country was we really realized at more than any other point in our history that foreign policy was in here, not just out there. That, for reasons of geography, foreign policy had really been somewhere else. People flew around the world and did it. Wars were largely fought on other soils. But on September 11th, Americans realized that, in effect, foreign policy was in here and not just out there. That's a profound change, I think, for us as a country, as a political culture, and in terms of a foreign policy agenda. And there's nothing, and a couple of panelists said this, that any leader could say to anybody in this country that could genuinely talk about the elimination of risk. We can talk about the management and reduction of risk, but we cannot talk about the elimination of risk. And so for that reason, I think the issue has to stay at the top of the foreign policy agenda. Indeed, if one argues about the fundamental constitutional responsibilities that a president has, and given the threats of catastrophic terrorism and many other things, we don't want to turn around after another September 11th and say, oh gosh, why weren't we paying attention? So it has to stay at the top of the agenda. But my other 3 points are really what else, how, and with whom. The what else point is what I often think about as the September, not just this agenda that flowed out of September 11th, but the agenda that was with us on September 10th. We all went to bed on the night of September 10th, 2011. While it's true, having been through the 2000 presidential campaign, not a whole lot of attention was being paid to foreign policy issues. The reality was we faced a pretty full agenda on the night of September 10th, 2001. If you think about it for a second, the Cold War had ended. People often say it's not just 9/11, it's 11/9/89. And we were going through a major period of transition in the geopolitics of the world in terms of our relationships with former adversaries, Russia, China, and longstanding allies, Europe and Japan. And this was all in the mix. A lot of the things that we've been dealing with, so many of which were exacerbated by Iraq, weren't created by that. And so on the night of September 10th, we had a profound transformation of global geopolitics that dated back to the end of the Cold War. Whether you date that from 11/9/89 or whatever point you put is secondary. Secondly, we had just lived through a decade of ethnic conflicts in which words like ethnic cleansing and genocide got reintroduced to our everyday vocabulary. We debated a lot about who bore what share of the fault for the ethnic cleansings and genocides, the United Nations, the United States, administrations that I was a part of, European Union, whatever. But the reality was that the world had not found policies that were particularly effective for dealing with massive killings of people for things that we sort of thought, sort of hoped had gone away with the Holocaust, with Cambodia, et cetera. And there was much discussion, I'll come back to this in a second, about what to do about these issues. Thirdly, by September 10th, 2001, we knew that globalization was not just about creating McDonald's all over the world, that it wasn't so simple as being for or against it, but it was a complicated process. Indeed, by the late 90s, many countries that had benefited from globalization were beginning to have serious economic and financial problems with it. The Asian financial crisis of 1997, Latin America, which has been spinning in a lot of directions since the late 1990s. And so the issues posed by globalization, the global environment, global public health, long list, I think that we're all familiar with, were also with us. And fourth was the problems of democratization and human rights. We all lived through the great moments of the early 90s and late 80s, the Berlin Wall coming down. I still have a piece that I got, 6 months later on my bookcase. And Nelson Mandela getting out of jail, and all of those great moments, Yeltsin standing on a tank, what one might call sort of the poetry of democratization. But then we were left with the prose, the consolidation and the development of democratic institutions in countries, which is a tough slog. All of that was with us when we went to bed on September 10th. You know, for a period after September 11th, it was entirely understandable politically, psychologically, why we just didn't want to deal with those. But 3-4 years later, those issues didn't go away. They didn't stand still. And so the great challenge we face is both dealing with both the September 10th and September 11th agendas. It's a false choice to choose between them. And I agree with Michael Vickers in a sense of why the notion of a war on terrorism still is terminology that I use and that I'm not uncomfortable with, the importance of that. But you have to deal with both sets. A, because they're interrelated, and so if your only concern is terrorism, we can make all sorts of connections between the issues I talked about and terrorism. But B, because also they're intrinsically important in their own right. And so this is part of the policy challenge, is how to try to deal with both. The how question, a lot of points have been made, and let me just make a couple to add to them. We really need to have a healthy debate in our country about what's right and wrong about our policies. Okay? I flew up to Washington on Tuesday for meetings, actually at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And many of you who've flown into National, know those warnings, like don't get up, last 30 minutes. Well, a guy got up in our flight, and we've been what I've been calling quasi-hijacked, officially hijacked, to Dulles. Because a guy got up and he broke the rules, and the stewardess had to report it, and so we got diverted. And we sat on the tarmac for 3 hours, and we were surrounded by security vans. And the guy got pulled off the plane, and a lot of us had our days messed up, and an economist could do a calculation of what was lost in productivity of these 48 people being on them. I'm sorry, but I have to say that and taking my shoes off every day, every dollar spent on that, if I could put that to the Nunn-Lugar program, to secure loose nukes in the former Soviet Union and elsewhere, I'm not even saying spend it on health care or education, that's a separate debate. But we really have to have a healthy debate about the how, and we're not. We all know if we make a comment about taking our shoes off, forget about it. And so I think that when we talk about Homeland Security, whether it's port security or other issues or biological terrorism, precisely because of the threats we face, we've really got to think about what's right and what's wrong about our policies. Another point let me throw into the mix is the questions about use of force. There's a lot of debate about, came out with the Bush Doctrine and the notion of preemption in this world. Well, to come back to something I said before, that debate was starting about ethnic conflicts. Should the world have acted in January '94 in Rwanda when we had ample and reliable and credible warning about what was going to happen, rather than just trying to pick up the pieces after the genocide? To be a little provocative, I actually do believe that we have to think about not just force as a last resort, but sometimes force as an early resort. And I do believe that relates to threats from terrorism. I did not support the use in Iraq for a variety of reasons. But that question is with us about coercive policies as one of the hows. Not the only one, but I think we're going to be faced with some touch. One of my criticisms of Iraq is that in some ways it's delegitimized other issues that may come up, a little bit of, when we may actually need to try to build an international coalition to use force in a preemptive fashion vis-a-vis terrorism. Prevention. How do we think about prevention both operationally and things that Ambassador McNamara and Michael Vickers said are part of that? And how do we think of it in terms of how we set our own priorities? We need to have short-term and long-term responses that try to deal with this. It's very difficult, I know, from my experience in Washington and others, to do anything but deal with the inbox. But the problem with that is that you're always, and Pavitt was using this term just in the halls before, you're always being reactive. We need to think preventively, much more than we've been able to, and there's a lot of points that could be made about that. The Libya case is an interesting example in this respect, because notwithstanding what I said about sometimes the need for preemptive and preventive uses of force, Ambassador McNamara and I were together in Rome in December about a conference on Libya that was quite interesting, and I've just written a long article about this in which one of the lessons of Libya is a very interesting one. Here we got the original rogue, right, to make some profound policy changes. Gave up all its WMD programs, got out of the terrorism business, And my argument is that one of the ways we did that was a combination of having credible threats. It's not the case that, Gaddafi made his announcement 6 days after Saddam was captured, and that's what really caused it. If you really study it, these negotiations have been going on for a long time. But I think, there was a sense that military threats was an option. But it was really a story of diplomacy. Some secret talks have been going on since 1998 under the Clinton administration with the British and us, and continued in the Bush administration. And in essence, a whole series of steps were taken along the way. But the bottom line was we achieved policy change by taking regime change off the table. That there are any number of points in which the Gaddafis wanted to be reassured that compromises and concessions would not be seen as weakness and lead to thinking that you could come after them. And that many times you can get policy change by taking regime change off the table. And so as we deal with some of these regimes, whether it's Iran or North Korea, I don't think it's the case that having the biggest stick possible always gets you the concessions you want. So there is an important place for diplomacy here. Last point on the how is our own vulnerabilities. There's some things that you can't control in the world and some things you can. And there are a lot of aspects to the Middle East crisis. But one of them is our continued energy vulnerability. That's within our own control to a great extent. If we start to take our energy dependence seriously and the ways in which we cultivate that vulnerability, it won't make us undependent upon the Middle East, and we still need to stay involved in the Middle East, but to the extent that we make ourselves vulnerable, life is about the things you can control. When we start to take efficiency seriously in our vehicles and in other respects, we'll make a major contribution that no matter what we do militarily could contribute to. Last set of points on the with whom, and Ambassador McNamara covered a lot of these, so my time's running out, so let me just make a couple. One is I agree with the notion that the stuff that happens below the headlines in cooperation on terrorism is probably the most important. The intelligence sharing, the coordination of border security, judicial enforcement, all of those things are really far more important than the stuff that makes the headlines. And those need to continue. Some of that can happen, as he said, through the UN. Some of it really needs to continue on a bilateral and sort of mini multilateral basis. Because this is a classic example of scope and reach. We face a threat that's of global scope, and we need to have global reach to do it. We cannot do it on our own. And I think one of the problems we created through Iraq that we're now trying to deal with, I think a little more effectively, is we became to be seen as part of the problem, not part of the solution. That building coalitions and alliances was made more difficult. If you go back to September 12th, why was it that the whole world, even as they say, even in Paris, had outpourings of support for the United States? I think the answer was that much of the world was dealing with terrorism at that point. They thought that we were now in the ball game and that with our leadership, everybody could deal with terrorism more effectively. Beginning, I think, with the axis of evil speech, in which there was a sense that we were sort of ideologizing, if that's a word, the crusade. And with Iraq, I think the question began to be is whether we were more part of the problem in terms of working with us or part of the solution. We need to get back to being a leader of the security efforts globally, and I think some of that really comes with the willingness to try to deal with other countries on a coalition way and try to find some ways that we can work together more effectively than we've done. So all of these things, I think, go into the mix on the policy challenges, and I think it can make for a good further discussion. Thanks.
We will now take some questions. Ambassador Litt. David?
David Litt, I'm a Foreign Service Officer.
Excuse me, could you wait for the mic?
I sure will. David Litt, I'm a Foreign Service Officer. For 4 years, I was a political advisor to U.S. Special Operations Command from '98 to 2002, and saw up close what I thought was a very accurate analysis of the growing threats from asymmetric threats to the United States and to other countries, religious extremism, bioterrorism, and so on. And I would like to ask Michael Vickers, perhaps Ambassador McNamara, about the ongoing debate now about the future of the role of special operations in I guess what we call the protracted struggle against religious fanaticism in less than the global world.
Well, if there's a growth stock in the Department of Defense, it's Special Operations Forces. Very, very small in terms of budget and personnel. Total, there's about 47,000, but a lot of those are reservists or support. But they're stretched very thin. Afghanistan was essentially almost like very, very heavy soft war. And even Iraq, while it was one of the most soft-centric wars that we've had, I mean, in comparison to Vietnam, about 1 in every 10 soldiers that went into Iraq at the beginning were soft, and they did a lot of things that we formerly used conventional forces for. The question really, our fundamental problem in the war on terrorism right now, as I said, is building partner capacity, which SOF does very well, but there's only so many of them, and then finding the terrorists. If we can find the terrorists, our problem is over. And so there's a real migration from operations into intel occurring in that community right now. We still face the problem of very scarce resources. For instance, our specialized counterterrorist forces. You know, we have small numbers of them, and they can't be every place at once, and they tend to do big things, not the decentralized war in which we find ourselves. So there's a number of challenges, but they're being worked. The frictions in the U.S. government remain. Secretary Rumsfeld designated the Special Operations Command to be the supported command for certain aspects in the war on terrorism. What that means actually is they have command authority over an operation overseas, and the regional commanders, the Pacific Command or Central Command, or others, would be supporting. But there's been a lot of friction between the geographic commanders who own the real estate and the functional commander in Special Operations Command, as there are continuous frictions between various agencies of the U.S. national security establishment about whether you can put people in various places. And, you know, the debates we had in the 1980s exist today, post 9/11. They really haven't gone away.
Well, I think you've covered it, Michael, quite well. Just a footnote. In addition to the special forces dilemma that it faces those trying to restructure the Defense Department, you've also got civic action, military police, basically the low-tech end, if you will, and the small, rapid deployable, flexible forces that are so much more necessary now, given the strategic environment that we face, are precisely the areas where until 9/11 we didn't pay that much attention to, and we didn't put our resources into those forces. Now we're faced with situations where we're drastically short in all of those, building up rapidly on special forces, but we're not much better off in some of the other areas. And it raises a question of, you know, should we decommission an aircraft carrier or two in order to put the resources into much more flexible, smaller operational forces? If we don't do that, if the culture of the Defense Department can't take the shock of maybe 10 aircraft carriers instead of 12 or even 8, then I think we're in trouble.
Try to move around the room. Let's take this gentleman up here, then we'll come over here, and then back to the center.
Yeah, hi, I enjoyed your panel very much. I'm Tim Edgar from the ACLU. I'll be speaking tomorrow. And I guess I had a question about the war on terrorism, the idea of it being a war on terrorism. And I wanted to get your thoughts on, I think, the serious problems and challenges that would pose towards civil liberties in particular. And the problems I see are that if you accept the idea of a war on terrorism as a literal war, it's not one that's limited by nationality. So we don't have any particular nationality which we can define as our enemy, not limited by geography. We aren't limiting the war to zones of armed conflict in a traditional sense. And the issue of combatant status, of who is a combatant, is very murky. And the challenges that would pose for the presumption of innocence. And you know, there's a legal phrase, inter armes silent leges. In war, all laws are silent, which is not quite right. But it is true that when you put legally the framework of between two people in the language of war, rather than in the language of law enforcement or of other intelligence or other ways of looking at it, that the rights that people have are substantially diminished. And then the final point is that it would never end, that unlike traditional wars, you don't have a final point at which you can say the emergency has passed and we can return to the peacetime understanding of fundamental rights. So I guess I would ask a simple question, which is that for those of you who are advocating that the idea of a war on terrorism is the right way to frame it, is the right way to think about it, how would you deal with those particular challenges that this very different kind of war would pose? In other words, would you accept that because it's a war on terrorism, someone who's a suspected terrorist could be held indefinitely without charge, without access to counsel, just the way a soldier in a traditional war could? Or would you say, oh yes, I meant that it is a war on terrorism, but I wouldn't go that far because we have to think about it in a different way? And then what would that different way be?
Let's start with Michael Vickers, because he did endorse the concept of war on terror.
Yeah, I think for a variety of reasons, it is a war rather than a crime. I mean, Al-Qaeda and others use crime as a means to further their political or strategic ends, but not an end in itself like criminal organizations do. And I think the reason it's important to think about it as a war is not only because that's sort of the character of the conflict, even if it's peculiar and even if it has an uncertain end, but as Ambassador McNamara said, if you want the Department of Defense, for example, to take this seriously, this war that we have right now, and they need to develop very different theories of victory of how we're going to win it and ensure our security, you have to elevate it to their attention. Previously, it's been called a lesser included in case in the Department of Defense, which means basically it gets no resources. And now, in the department, basically has two kinds of wars that have been just shattered by the post-9/11 world. What we call swift defeats. You know, we stop someone, stop aggression very, very quickly, or decisive victory or decisive win, which Iraq is the model. We occupy a capital. Well, neither of those. You know, you ask yourself, well, the war on terrorism has at least been going on for 3 years. Does it look swift? You know, not to me. I mean, even though it's debated inside the Pentagon, are we going to occupy all the world's capitals to win it? No. So we better start thinking about this nature of the war that we have. And as far as the civil liberties, I think it's not my area, and I think it is a big concern. But I would remind folks, I think the Cold War analogy was really a good one in terms of protracted competition. And back to the social science analogy, at the early Cold War, because of the nature of that threat, ideological and global and blah, 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 there were a lot of predictions of the so-called garrison state, that mobilization of American society would require this great militarization. Well, it didn't happen for lots of reasons. As a good friend of mine, Aaron Friedberg, wrote a book on, namely American political tradition and anti-statism. And I think the war on terrorism will prove no different.
Any other members of the comment?
I guess I'd say, because that, you know, my understanding, and I'm also not a lawyer, is that, you know, the use of the term is really a political use of the term and doesn't necessarily imply or carry with it some of the legal problems that you've raised. It clearly can and does, as it did in the immediate aftermath, and it has at other points. But I would sort of side with your latter thing. Yes, you know, the use of the term is being used in a, you know, in sort of a affective, subjective way. I don't know that it necessarily means that everything else has to follow from that. I actually think that if you look at the public opinion polls, the public kind of gets it. You know, the public basically gets it, that the use of the term is a lot like the Cold War and the war on poverty. The war on poverty failed not because we called it a war, but because we had lousy policies for it, you know, and that weren't well designed for it. So I don't think that A sort of implies B there. But I think the public can understand a differentiation along the lines that is, I agree with you, it's very important to make those from a civil liberties perspective. I think you can make that case to the public. The public has a certain pragmatism, you know, to it. And for me, the value of it is a little bit of the comprehensive nature. I actually think you have a better chance of getting resources and attention for some of the political and other dimensions of this by casting it not just as sort of the old, you know, foreign aid or some of the other umbrellas could go under it. So it's a problem, I agree with you, but I think that it's a manageable problem and that there are trade-offs with some of the benefits you get politically.
Just a brief word. Study of terrorism and counterterrorism had for many years sort of fallen into this dichotomy. Terrorism was either crime or it was war. You couldn't say it was terrorism, which is neither crime nor war, actually. but it had to be. So in a way, calling it a war was to distinguish it from a mere crime, because it was always a mere crime, and to say who had jurisdiction over the problem. And if we hadn't sort of trapped ourselves into that kind of dichotomy where it had to be either or, we might not have reached so quickly for the war metaphor, which I agree is more of a metaphor than an accurate definition of what's going on.
Well, no, I think it's been said. As I said in my remarks, I think the term has been so devalued by overuse and application to completely inappropriate subjects that the problem that you raise is much less serious. The American public, as Bruce says, they understand. War is a politician's way of saying, hey guys, I'm really serious. And beyond that, it could mean almost anything. The war on terror is no more a war than the war on drugs was a war and is a war. Or the war on paper, the war on poverty, the war on... Any country that can declare war on cancer doesn't understand the meaning of the term.
Right, down here in front, yes.
My name is Brittany Benowitz. I'm with the Center for National Security Studies. First of all, I wanted to thank the panel for your candor in talking about the type, especially some of you who have experience in the government, reaching some of the analyses that you have. My question is about, there's a lot of talk now about questioning some of our underlying assumptions in the intelligence field. I wanted to, Mr. Vickers, my question actually is two-part for you. You said part of what we need to do is keep the conflict Muslim on Muslim. And I was struck by that for two reasons. First, because we know that Al-Qaeda has been, many of the recruits have come from Algeria, a country that's experienced protracted Muslim on Muslim violence, 100,000 civilian dead. And it seems to me that one can only make the comment that we need to keep the conflict Muslim on Muslim if it's assumed that we just are firmly lodged in the assumption that this is a problem of radical fundamentalism, as opposed to being a problem of militancy. And if we say it's really a question of militancy, much more than it's a question of any religion or fundamentalism, and my question is, are we questioning that underlying assumption so we don't just start off along the wrong line from the get-go? My follow-up question is, it struck me, what if we were to take this statement, we need to keep the conflict Muslim on Muslim, and say, former CIA clandestine operative says that we need to keep the conflict Muslim on Muslim, and we broadcast that in the Middle East. Regardless of, I mean, I'm sure that your intent is very pragmatic in making this statement, but it certainly isn't going to help us win the hearts and minds of people in the Middle East, and which arguably, no matter what your perspective, is very important. My question is also, what room is there in the analysis for thinking about those sort of questions?
I'm certainly not a diplomat. I don't choose my words as carefully as I should. I think if we said, well, the conflict really, as bin Laden would like it to be, Western on Muslim, they would like it even less. And I mean, as I said, our fundamental strategic problem is that to varying degrees, we're dealing with cooperative governments. I mean, we may not like those governments, but there are far more friends, if you will, than there are adversaries. And so when you look at the range of strategic choices, and you see some say, you know, we really need big change in Saudi Arabia. We need, you know, this here or that there. You got to be careful about what you wish for in terms of destabilization. You know, you may not like the effect of your strategies, and so all I mean by the Muslim on Muslim is if a goal of the adversary is to galvanize the Islamic world to make it against whoever they think is not them, mainly the West, but also any infidel or any, you know, an apostate Muslim, whether ruling a state or insufficiently pious, we want to defeat that strategy. I mean, as I said, one of their principal goals is to do things that will catalyze a broader movement. We want to prevent that catalyzation, and so by helping other governments to deal with the causes, but also to ensure their security. And of course, as you point out, a lot of the Islamic states are or as Professor Crenshaw did, you know, they're good at sort of domestic security, rather bloody-minded about it, but then export their problem elsewhere. I mean, there are consequences to this, but that's the war, you know, that's the range of our strategic choices, as I see it.
Yes, sir. Here in front. Here comes the microphone.
Warren Edgerton, U.S. District Judge. All four of you commented on not going it alone, and I'll concentrate on Ambassador McNamara because I think he led the charge on that. And I agree that it's important not to go it alone, but isn't it important for us now to reconsider some things that we looked at differently before 9/11? Our opposition to treaties that have been signed by most countries in the world, genocide, global warming, international tribunals, shouldn't we give some thought about getting a little leverage by signing some of those things so that we can get a little cooperation on the war on terrorism?
Yeah, I think, in fact, I guess more than think, I hope that the second Bush administration will reassess the benefits of kind of rugged individualism on those issues in light of the fact that after having moved in that direction, we came upon 9/11 and the need for those same countries to back us after we, in effect, slapped them in the face. I was asked about this up on the Hill once, a group of senators in a little back and forth on terrorism, and I said that it's not unlike the senator who would go down and basically preach to his constituents about what he wants and what he thinks is best, and not listen to them tell him what they want and what they think is best, and then come election time, turn around and say, okay, you're all behind me now, aren't you? We didn't get as much support after we came into the, let's say, the 2002, 2003 timeframe, in part, not exclusively. There were much more fundamental disputes related to the war in Iraq that caused that division with our allies. But one of the major elements was that we had just gone through in the immediate period before that, and in fact continued during the 2003 war in Iraq, to stiff the other countries in a way that was considered to be arrogant and not very sympathetic. And in diplomacy and international affairs, there's no free lunch. Everything has a price, and you've got to decide whether the benefits of doing whatever you're doing is worth whatever the price, because it will have a price at some point.
There were another question? There were, yes, Ms. Mayor.
Hi, Jackie Northam with National Public Radio. It was something that you said again, Mr. Vickers, and that was about the dangers triggering a defensive jihad. I actually, with Tony, cover Guantanamo and for the abuse stuff and all the torture policies and that. And I'm wondering if our policies that were written up and in part still exist on torture, on holding detainees, what the ACLU fellow brought up about terms like enemy combatants and that. I wonder if these are contributing to what could be a defensive jihad, and also, are these policies that should, if not, always be reassessed?
Well, that's hard for me to assess, but what I was referring to is when we have a direct approach where we have a large-scale occupation, a protracted occupation of the Islamic world, like we do in Iraq right now. You know, it may produce some benefits, but it also has a significant downside in the sense that in that it feeds into that assertion that bin Laden rather cleverly did in his last statement, that look, we're fighting you because, why aren't we fighting the Swedes? Because they're not here, you are, you know, and so you're the problem because you're here. And so when we talk about strategy that we are going to transform, you know, a key means in our strategy is to transform the greater Middle East, to convert, essentially, if you will, to, you know, democratize, if not put in religious terms. We have to be careful about the, you know, the way that's perceived. Is that aggression by another term? You know, if our goal is to defeat terrorism or suppress it to such a low level that it doesn't rise to the national security threat it does today, this issue of offensive or defensive jihad, which others are far more expert on that than I am, and how one decides what it is, and how it should affect our strategy. But, you know, my understanding is you can rally much, much greater support if you think that this is defensive, as again, most cultures can. You know, we're being attacked, we have to do something about it. So I think that's why I think our policies have to be more indirect and more subtle in that regard across elements of power.
Let me just follow up on that a little bit too. I think, you know, one of the issues that comes up is what you say you are and what you do, you know, and that there's a gap there, and that while it's undoubtedly true that a certain amount of resentment, whether it's in the Muslim world or elsewhere, kind of comes with so-called being number one, we can kind of put that aside and still look at the parts that are related to the ways in which we conduct ourselves in the world. In some ways it relates to your question as well. And that you really can't have it both ways. You can't say you stand, nobody expects you to be perfect, but to the extent that you're vulnerable to the hypocrisy critique, which is a big gap between what you say you stand for and what you do. In the old-fashioned 19th century European powers, we said, you know, we're all realpolitik, and they didn't, you know, they didn't believe in principles. We said that was always one of our characteristics. Well, that can be a strength, but it also can lead to a vulnerability. So part of the, you know, I've been struck by how much the response to Guantanamo in Europe, and I was even in China during Abu Ghraib, not that they have the greatest human rights record, but that issue was still there, and how it played around the world had to do with this, what you say and what, you know, what you do. And in some ways it relates to our sort of broader appeal about democracy. You know, a lot of the world doesn't, you know, care only about that. They care about some of the issues about, you know, sustenance and if we're going to, you know, and social values and basic survival skills. And so we want to figure out how these things play, not to just to domestic audiences, but how they play globally, and at least factor that into the way we try to strike this balance between trying to take a stand based on principles and understanding that if we have this gap between rhetoric and practice, it really works against us, even though we may want to say it's unfair or others do it too. It becomes a real problem of power and influence.
Up in the back?
Hi, Kermit Jones, Duke Law School. Talking about the issue of trying to decrease our energy dependence, I had a question for the panel concerning, do you think that there's a political disconnect in the sense of, it seems as if our policies might be that, you know, we say we want to decrease energy dependence, but like maybe the last administration really tried to stress decreasing energy dependence, which I think might have been like the Carter administration, was completely knocked out the box. And do you feel that this is more of a problem with, let's say, the American people, like in the sense of, you know, we don't look at some of the issues that might be associated with trying to go push more hybrid cars into the market or things along those lines versus, let's say, the government possibly trying to secure more oil either through the Middle East or Venezuela or Western Africa?
I'd say, since I brought that up, I think the latter thing is less, that's diversifying our portfolio, which is not necessarily, it is decreasing our dependence on a particular supplier, but I don't think it really gets at the problem. And here I think that it, you know, it comes back to the point earlier, I think, about the pragmatism of the American public. I mean, I actually believe we're seeing an interesting change in the nature of this issue, right? In the 70s, it was, you know, sort of a liberal issue. You know, Tom Friedman's been writing a lot about the geo-greens and the notion that being green is good geopolitics and getting a little bit of a security angle there. And you're even seeing on the conservative side of the issue some sense of, you know, of energy efficiency can be a national security policy, not just a feel-good policy. So I think we may be coming into a moment where there's possibilities for different political coalitions on this than might have been possible before. The other point, I think, is that we get scared away. I mean, in the early 90s, I think it's fair to say that the Clinton administration really messed up the health care issue, and it became a third rail in American politics. Nobody wanted to touch it. So what happened, we now have a health care crisis again, where a huge percentage of our GDP is going to it. And, you know, part of the reasons that auto manufacturers can't compete is because of the cost of health care going into the price of a Chrysler or whatever, or, bad example, but a Chevrolet, since Chrysler's not necessarily American anymore. So I think that there are, you can't get scared away from these issues. You have to come back to them because they're fundamental policy challenges. And you have to understand the politics of them. but ultimately we have, and we could talk about other financial dependencies and others, there's a shepherding your power, not squandering your power message to be had out there. I happen to think that it's politically sellable and it's good policy, and you can bring the two together.
We'll take 3 more questions because we're running out of time. Yes, sir.
I'm Horace Robertson, Professor of Law Emeritus at Duke University. My question is primarily for Ambassador McNamara. You carefully answered the previous question down here about unilateralism. You said you hope that the Bush administration would rely less on it in the second administration. I wonder if you see signs that they are actually doing so. I think particularly of the appointment of Mr. Bolton as ambassador to the UN, and there are others as well.
Hope springs eternal, though. I can't say that I see any fundamental changes in the policies, but I hope I see a change in a sense that the optics of the policies that were followed particularly in the first 2.5 years, 3 years, when we got into Iraq deeply and realized we were in that, there was a change in attitude, perceptible in the statements. We heard more of, we want to consult, we'd like to understand, we need you to help. When you start talking like that, you necessarily are going to have to make some adjustments in your policies. And I'm not sure at this point. Condi Rice has her work cut out for her, but she certainly started out on the right foot both internally within the State Department, within the administration, and up on Capitol Hill. And she started out right by making the tours that she made of the Middle East and Asia and into Africa and Europe, et cetera, to listen, not to go and preach. And so, I'm somewhat optimistic. And as far as John Bolton is concerned, I know him quite well. I've worked with him. He's a very bright fellow. He's also not a diplomat.
Makes me look good.
But I guess even there, hope springs eternal. After all, Nixon went to China.
All right. Yes, sir. Next question. In the second row back. Down here. Down front here.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Will Curtis from the U.S. Naval Academy. My question is to the entire panel. I read one analyst recently said that what we've been experiencing is essentially a truce, in that jihad, in essence, as you know, there are two jihad approaches. The lesser jihad is the one that has essentially been pushed into the background. It is now coming forth. And that in the final analysis, what the Islamics want is an Islamization of the entire world. And that we, in the final analysis, there is no option. You either accept it or you pay the toll or the tax, and where you have this temporarily truce. And that essentially that's what we've been in. And now, even if the U.S. agreed to move out of the Middle East, settle the Palestinian problem, it would not solve the problems from the jihadist approach. How do you feel about that? And how do you develop policies if that indeed is objective?
Okay. Well, that's a really big question, but I'll just take a small stab at it and in trying to answer it, referring back to some of the things that the first panel said this morning. You're actually dealing with a very, very, very small number of people who are engaged in the use of violence, and particularly violence against the United States and against the West, because a lot of the violence that we've seen, as our NPR, I think you reminded us about Algeria, a lot of the extremely high levels of violence have been, in effect, intrastate in Muslim societies and in other conflict-prone societies rather than against the U.S. or against the West. So you're dealing with very, very small conspiratorial groups who do not necessarily reflect a mass sentiment. I think the causal relationship between these groups and mass sentiments is very weak. And if you look at September the 11th, and if you agree that what Osama bin Laden wanted was to present a catalyst, as Michael Vickers said, in order to mobilize the Muslim world against the West, he failed abysmally. There was more sympathy for the United States, and that sympathy did persist through support for the war in Afghanistan, which I think was widely perceived as justifiable in the nature of the attack. So I don't think that these small groups reflect what a large number of people think. They do reflect particular interpretations of ideology and religion, and I think what you have to look at is these very small groups in dealing with them. I think there's a real danger in exaggerating the threat and thinking that what really are still a small number of acts of violence, and in terms of all things that produce casualties in the world, particularly genocides and civil conflicts, still a small number of casualties associated with terrorism, that we don't want to fall into the trap that they're setting for us in terms of magnifying what they're doing and making it appear to be the reflection of a mass movement. I really don't think that it is.
I would agree with that. The German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer had called it Islamist totalitarianism, which is another way of getting at it, but putting it in a frame that we're a little familiar with from other forms of totalitarianism and differentiating it from being about Islam. And I think that Martha's absolutely right, in terms of percentages. On the other hand, it only took small percentages of Bolsheviks to change history. But fundamentally, I think this is about where you bring together sort of the short, medium, and long term. The kinds of strategies you need militarily and diplomatically, but also the creation of options in the Arab and the Islamic world. If you put together the 3 Arab Human Development Reports that have now been produced in the last 3 years, and you begin to talk about the needs for, better, opportunities in governance, so that there's not an option between just the status quo, and the appeal of the extreme, that helps. And at the same time that you develop the capabilities, I think Tom had mentioned that, or Martha, the definition. There's now being an agreed upon definition that came out of the Madrid conference this year. I think one of the things at the international level is establishing the importance of really strengthening the norm that whatever your political issues, that this is not an acceptable way to achieve them. And so it's happening at a lot of levels. But fundamentally, I think the questions of genuine political and economic and social reform in these societies really holds off a future where you're still going to have extremists to deal with. But it's not going to be this dichotomous, recreation of the caliphate sort of thing.
We are out of time, so I cannot take the third question that I promised somebody I would let them ask. But I have one announcement before I end this panel, which is the winner of the door prize is Bruce Jentleson.
I left my watch.
Thanks, Gil. Join me in thanking our panelists. For those of you who have signed up to join us for the lunch featuring Jim Pavitt, the lunch will be in the Thomas Center, which, if you're not familiar, you'll go out the door and take a right to the end of the corridor, and then take another right down the corridor outside the building and across the covered walkway. That will take you directly into the dining room of the Thomas Center. We have no designated seating other than a head table, but you will probably want to congregate down by the lower quadrant, as you'll see down there. It is a buffet, but it's not really a buffet for any of you who have ever eaten at the Thomas Center. It's probably some of the finest food anywhere in eastern North Carolina. So we do invite you to go through the line, find a table, and we look forward to seeing you in a few minutes. The luncheon will start at 12:15.
It's nice.
12:45.